right. Well, I see there's quite a few of you here tonight. I'm seeing 174, which is very nice. I'm glad you're here. And such an interesting topic, isn't it? For us to figure out what on earth is going on and how our economies will be affected. Of course, economists don't have any special knowledge of the future, but all we can do is apply the tools that we have that we can apply to any event. And so we're going to go through these together and let's see what you think. And at the end, we can talk about, how you view the whole thing. But what I'd like to do is try to talk about quantifying how this event, which is a black swan event, will affect our economy. And, a black swan event is just something unpredictable with potentially severe consequences. And so, something that comes out of the blue that you didn't expect. And then, of course, at the end of this definition, it says the widespread insistence, they were obvious in hindsight. And I'm sure most of you have seen Bill Gates' 2015 TED Talk. And if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to see it, where he says, if something's going to bring us down, the next thing to bring us down is not going to be a nuclear war. It's going to be a virus. So what we want to see is how this pandemic will affect us. And we're just going to ask some simple questions. What's going on? Where is it going on? When will, how long will this impact last? Why will it affect our economies? And then especially as we quantified it, how will it affect them and how much will it affect them? So we're just going through a really simple analysis of events and trying to come up with some answers. Well, obviously the what is the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. I don't need to tell you anything about it because I'm sure you are as obsessed as I am watching the news every day. And if we think of the where and we think about the nations that are most affected now, in economics, we have to update our slides frequently. But with the coronavirus, you've got to be on it every day. So this was just today. And there was a big difference from the earlier numbers I had on this slide. This is the number of confirmed cases in the world and the number of deaths in the world. And if you look at the map, this shows you the dark red regions are the ones that have deaths of 10,000 or more, cases of 10,000 or more. And so as you look at this, you notice there are some common characteristics. There are regions that are heavily exposed to trade. Now, I've put this over by China, but Europe, of course, is an area very, very open to trade, as is the United States. And you can see Brazil as well in that regard, in Australia. And then another characteristic is that these are regions that have extensive free movement of people. So if you think about free movement within the European Union, how do you close your borders? Or within the United States, how will you ever close the movement from one state to another? And then finally, when I look at this map, what I also see is that the coastal regions tend to be more affected. The interior is a little bit more protected. I mean, if you look at Africa, for instance, you see they're not heavily exposed to trade or to free movement of people. And so, they do have coastal regions, but a lot of the countries have not been hit, fortunately, yet. This was today's toll. And so this group of countries is ordered by number of cases. We can see that China is still first in number of cases. But in deaths, both Italy and Spain have passed China. And you can see it was only about 3 days ago, I think, the US passed Spain in number of cases. Of course, the potential for cases in the United States is extremely high. So anyway, this is just a picture of where it's hitting hardest. And, when I mentioned that the coasts are affected the most, look at the United States. You can see the areas that are on the borders, on the Gulf, or on the Atlantic, or on the Pacific also are heavily affected, where the interior, there's not that much movement. Well, the next thing we want to see is when it ends and how it ends. And so just thinking about countries' responses to these, first of all, let me give you some scenarios. Goldman Sachs had a call not too long ago, and they gave, and I'll cite this a couple of times, but they gave their best case scenario, okay? They were thinking of the United States and some other countries, big countries. So they said probably half of Americans will contract it, means about 150 million people. about 70% of Germans, because they are, it's not such a big country with isolated areas. And they believe the peak would be reached in mid-May in the United States. Now, we're hoping here in Spain, aren't we, that the peak is this week. So anyway, they expected a peak would be reached, it would decline thereafter, and then, as all of us have heard, in the summer, it should subside because it doesn't do as well, we think, in warm weather. And most of those who catch it are going to have mild symptoms. Only 5% will have severe symptoms, and only 2% will die. Now, if you think in a big country, that's not a small number of people. But anyway, and then they say, if you follow the extreme measures for 8 weeks, the worst is over and the virus will begin to mutate and will be dead by fall 2020. This, as I said before, is the optimistic scenario. And they say vaccine is well on the way. Some treatments are working. So, we need to be careful, of course, but it's not going to be as massive as some people think. Now, the worst case scenario came out of Imperial College, and I'm sure many of you have seen. They ran a simulation. The gentleman directing the simulation, by the way, is now sick with the coronavirus. But this was a scenario that really got all of us thinking about what we wanted to do. They said, if we don't check the epidemic, it's going to affect 80% of all people around the world. And by mid-April, only 1 out of 30 could actually be treated adequately because we don't have the critical care facilities. And they said that the peak would be reached after 3 months, the peak in mortality. So that's later than the Goldman Sachs assumption. And the vaccine will take 18 months to develop. So they estimated that without severe intervention on the behalf of governments, there could be 2.2 million deaths in the United States and 510,000 in the UK. And they recommended 2 responses. One could be mitigation. So you just, kind of try to keep it down, hold down the number of cases while your population builds up its immunity. The other one is suppress it. It doesn't matter what it costs your economy. It doesn't matter what it costs your social life. You suppress it. So, and these were 2 of the scenarios that Imperial College commented on. One is this scenario if we do nothing. And so, the daily cases peak here, and we don't have months or numbers on this, but just it's the concept. They peak here and then they drop off. Now, the other idea is we mitigate it somehow. And so we never reach this terrible peak, but they last longer, and the number of cases in the end is somewhat similar. Now, this one puts numbers and dates on it. So they ran their simulation for the UK and for the United States. And this is where they got the number of 510,000 with this early peak in the UK in June, and the peak in the United States arriving a little bit later. Sorry, the UK peak is mid-May, and the peak in the United States is June. And they talk about the numbers here, which is, those are really frightening numbers. And so we have been debating since the first moment the virus appeared, but especially since Imperial College simulation, what do we do? And so we're seeing some international differences. One difference is over, do we test massively or not? Now, obviously, some countries are not testing massively because they don't have tests. And this is a case of the United States and of Spain. But some countries have deliberately gone after massive testing. Germany and South Korea are 2 of them. They are carrying out some 16,000 tests a day. And what they do then is when they find someone who is infected, they isolate them and follow up on them. And they also follow up on all their contacts, test them, isolate the ones that are infected. And this thing continues and continues. And they've managed to keep the deaths way down. The US is way behind, and many European countries, including Spain, started very late. But I think maybe the Asian response, this certainly doesn't explain Germany, but the Asian response has to do with having experienced an epidemic before. And so they knew what to do. They were prepared. And so they, whipped out their toolkit. The World Health Organization did offer a test to all of us, although the US turned it down. But the idea is vigilance, very fast response, test, isolate, trace contacts, quarantine the exposed, and putting all these pieces together to really limit the spread. Some of them did not have to shut down their countries. So Singapore has kept its schools open. Here you have the number of tests performed per million. And you can see how high South Korea is. It's more than twice what we see in Italy. And this is, of course, per million. It's adjusted for population size. Do you see how very low the United States is? Very, very small number of tests. And now, the other big difference is over whether we do mitigation or suppression. Do we allow sort of this herd immunity that Boris Johnson talked about to develop? We allow people to be exposed to light amounts of the virus, and they develop an immunity, and eventually, we're okay. Or do we suppress it harshly? So what Spain is doing, and what many other countries now are doing in some US states, is to quarantine. So what you want to do is separate people so the rate of transmission slows down. And the reason is actually, you're not going to be able to stop the disease, but so the healthcare system is prepared to handle the load. A little bit later, we're going to look at number of beds and number of doctors. And but this is the approach that Italy has been using, that China used, that Spain is using, and that some U.S. states are using. It does cause a lot of economic damage. We'll talk about that later. And of course, your civil rights are infringed. I mean, a country like China can do it, but in Western countries, it's a hard thing to do, isn't it? To say to people, you can't go out of your house, you can't get in your car. I think about my own country. I'm American, and I don't know how they're going to tell Americans to do that. And for Spaniards and Italians, who are people that live very much in the streets and very sociable, it's a really hard thing to do. And the other approach is just allow the virus to spread so that herd immunity is developed. You try to control the rate, but you don't follow severe measures. There are problems with both approaches. So one of them is, if we're quarantining, say we're Spain and we're quarantining severely, there's still going to be a virus when we stop our quarantining. And so what will stop us from once again going back into the initial phase? I don't really see the answer to that. And maybe some of you are medical experts and you can enlighten us about that. But the other approach, which is, allow the herd immunity to develop, is not sustainable either, because eventually when you see the number of deaths mount up, the population will protest against that, and they're going to tell the government they're not doing their job. And so, the estimates were that the UK, if they didn't clamp down and do a quarantine, could lose between 35,000 and 70,000 additional people. So often approach 2 is forced to become approach 1, and you have more deaths. So, the UK was using the herd immunity approach, and they have now shut down. And the Netherlands is shutting down. They were very liberal about it, and now they're shutting down. So it seems like more of us are selecting the first, but then there, of course, is that other group of countries that followed very rigorous testing and tracing of contacts and isolation that didn't face the number of deaths that we did. This just shows why social distancing, such as we do in a quarantine, is so important. If we're assuming that every person infects 2.5 people in normal behavior, right, in 5 days, then in 30 days, that single person has infected 406. Whereas if we reduce contact by half, then they're going to only infect 1.25 people. And you can see that turns in 30 days to only 15. So this is such a tremendous difference. And we hope that in Spain, we're going to see this soon, right? Now that the quarantine has lasted almost 2 weeks, and, the infection, the developing of the virus period is passing. Now, if we have 75% less contact, then you come to what epidemiologists talk about, that R0, where, if it gets below 1, it means that every one person affects fewer people than themselves. And therefore, in 30 days, we would only have one person affecting 2.5. So this is what we're thinking about when we're doing social distancing. And just to show you some graphs, and this was in the New York Times, whose coverage of this has been wonderful. I don't know if you read them, but this said, we do nothing, United States. We do nothing as a country. Then roughly a third of Americans could become infected. And so you see this happening at the peak, which they assumed would be in July. And then you see the number of deaths, 1 million deaths, okay? And then if you intervene, so when you start to intervene, you can see that in the United States at peak, there would be 1.8 million people affected. And then the number would drop off as we apply social distancing, and the total deaths would be a lot less. Now, they also did an interesting simulation of when do you start. So you see here they're starting in June, and here they're starting in July. So the number of infections is much larger, right? 1.8 million at peak and 169,000 total. If you wait longer, it's 5.9 million at peak and 407,000 total. And then they also simulated, do you use very aggressive measures or mild measures or modest measures? So here are the mild measures. We don't do much. We start in April, and you can see we hit the 9 million infections at the peak and almost 1 million deaths. Now, if we use modest measures, do you see how this changes? 3 million and 320,000. And if we use aggressive measures, there's 513,000 infections at the peak and 51,000 total deaths. Still big numbers, but the severe intervention in these simulations comes out much better in terms of the toll. And here, we have some cultural differences among countries. And I often think about the German situation. In Italy and in Spain, young people are living with older people. And so since the older people are especially vulnerable and the young people are out a lot, they're bringing it home to parents or grandparents. And this may be one reason why these rates are so high in Italy and Spain. Another reason is simply that they are more sociable. They're out of their houses more, which means you come into more contact. So what if we place harsh restrictions and then we remove them later? And the Imperial College survey did something about this. Now, let me explain this a little bit. You can see this was scenario 1 that we saw earlier, where you do nothing. There's a peak of cases. Then they eventually drop off and people continue to be infected, but it's a lot less, okay? Scenario 2 was a severe isolation, okay? And you can see how that green line becomes quite flat. But when we stop the isolation, do you see how we have another peak? Okay, now they zoomed in on it on the chart below, so you can see a little bit better. Do you see how in July we've got a really low number of cases, but when the fall comes and the weather gets cold again, do you see how we surge again in scenario 2? And then scenario 3, again, we've got school closures, case isolation, social distancing, again peaking later after the summer. So, there's a lot of question. I feel this myself a lot of times. I'm thinking, what happens afterwards? You feel a bit of vertigo because you're shutting everything down, but for how long? And, is it just going to come back when we open our doors again? So what we're here today for is to talk about what happens to the global economy. So we're going to talk a little bit about how economists think. And what we usually think of are that there are 3 possible channels that can affect GDP. One is the supply side of the economy. We call it aggregate supply. So sometimes things disturb the supply side of the economy, like oil prices go up, okay? Then there's the demand side of the economy, which is consumers, investors, or governments buy less. Okay, when they buy less, companies can't sell as much, and so then we have fall in their sales, a fall in employment, fall in salaries, and consumption falls further. And then we also have animal spirits, which the idea is that nothing really happens in the real economy, but out here where the financial sector lives, out here outside of the real economy, there can be panic or there can be euphoria. People rush in to buy things and cause a bubble, or people rush out and sell things and cause a crash. And this then affects demand because people lose their wealth, people are afraid, and demand shrinks. So these are the three we want to think about here. And this is the dynamics that we would be looking at. Here's your aggregate supply and your aggregate demand. Wherever they meet one another, you get GDP. Okay, in this picture you can see it's at 7 billion. So if they move, let's assume, I talked about an oil shock before. Okay, let's assume that aggregate supply shifts left because oil prices go up. You see, aggregate supply has gone left. You will see a smaller GDP and more inflation. Do you see that? If instead aggregate demand goes right, okay, you would see, and you can see it here, a larger GDP and more inflation. So, this is our simplest diagram, but it's really, really useful for thinking about how things will affect you, okay? So initially, when we started out with the coronavirus news coming out of China, initially we worried about the supply effects because the supply chains around the world were very tightly integrated. This is part of globalization. So companies in our countries produced parts in China or in India or in Vietnam or wherever they were producing them. And then margins were very thin, so they really needed those low costs as far as inputs. And they also practiced just-in-time management. So they didn't keep a huge stock of parts. They only kept probably parts for 15 to 30 days. So this is what the global supply chains look like, and we can see that they're especially important in the automotive sector and technology. I mean, you know that the iPhones, all the parts are done in China and most of the assembly as well. Fashion, medical equipment, which is important, and then components for the pharmaceutical industry. So here's the framework. We're all integrated tightly, and we rely on those parts to come in every 15 days, at most every month. When they're gone, we can't manufacture anymore. So what happened was in Wuhan, where the virus started, there were probably 51,000 companies that had at least one direct supplier in Wuhan. And that just for a part. And then tier two, there were at least 5 million companies. So, a lot of them were importing parts or were assembling things in Wuhan. And just this chart shows, this was a Dun & Bradstreet study, this chart shows how those businesses were distributed, very, very, not very granular. You can see 28% of them were in services. You can see manufacturing is 15%. Even finance had 6.8% of their, sort of outsourced, of their activity outsourced there. Construction. And then if we look at the countries that were exposed, you can see Hong Kong was the most exposed to Wuhan, but the United States, 19% of companies had a headquarter and business operations there. And you see in Japan, it was 12. And then we go on over, we see some European countries. So that was a supply effect. Let me just go back. So that's a supply effect. If we go to our chart that we were looking at just a minute ago, you can see that what would happen here in this case is aggregate supply would do that. It would go into the left, okay, because we can't get our parts. So we have to slow down production. That would have caused a recession if it were to persist, right? So, but then what else happened? Well, we had this oil price shock. Oil prices went down because of the price war between the Saudis and the Russians, which incidentally has a huge impact on the United States because we are the world's largest producer and a lot of it is shale production, and our costs are higher. Our marginal costs are higher. So when the Saudis and the Russians start having a price war and bringing prices down, as you see in the right-hand panel, this will put shale out of business. So this will make the recession deeper in the United States. So anyway, if we're thinking of our supply curve, it went in because of those, because of the supply chains being interrupted. But lower fuel prices should move it back out for importing countries. Now, for exporting countries, this will be a negative aggregate demand effect because they export petroleum, and so they're now exporting less, okay? But this sounds like old history to me, because I remember when this whole thing first started, we were saying, okay, I wonder how much this could affect our economies. And we started thinking a little bit about how China's fall in growth would affect us. So we'll look at that first, but right now, everything else has overwhelmed us. So demand, aggregate demand, is consumption, investment, and government spending. And as we have placed these drastic restrictions on our economies, and as we've been battling the virus, consumption declines drastically. Now, consumption in many of our economies is as high as 70% of GDP, at least 60, right? Between 60 and 70% of GDP. So if that falls by 10%, think of how that affects GDP. So all of these things will affect consumption, then investment. Who's going to invest right now? We don't know. So many investment projects, most investment projects have stopped, and only government spending. And we think of consumption, investment, and government spending, only that can go up. And in fact, as we'll see soon, it's gone up quite a lot. So initially we said, all right, let's think about the demand side. Let's think about how the fall in Chinese demand will affect us, okay? The thought is, if China falls sharply, they won't want to buy so much of our stuff. Their tourists won't travel so much. So that demand shock in China will affect us. So just a few pictures of how big the reduction might be in China. This is a composite that the Financial Times does every day. By the way, they're doing an amazing job of covering this virus. So you can see the labor migration is about up to normal. Coal consumption is still down by more than 20%. Freight logistics activity is down by about 12%. And urban transportation is still down more than 40%, okay? And here, this is, putting it all together. What the Financial Times has done here is you can see what 2019 looked like. So normally in the new year, everything stops for a while and they go back to their villages. But then after the New Year celebrations, the economy picks up. Okay, so this line at the top is what things would have looked like if 2020 had been exactly like 2019. But actually 2020, when the new year was over, it's continued down. Now you can see there's a small pickup, but we are still 40% down on an index basis from where we probably would be. Okay, so this is a large decrease in China. Here's another way to look at it. There's two charts. One is showing the growth in industrial production in percent. The other one shows it in index numbers. And again, anytime you go below 50, it's a contraction, but you can see this one has gone down to 35.7. So definitely a contraction in manufacturing. And this should affect countries that export to China. So this is the first effect I was talking about. Florida, for instance, scrap metal wood exports. They sell them to China. They've gone down very drastically. You can see the fall is from 140 million in one case down to 40 million. So it's very, very substantial. These other falls are smaller. But anyway, this is the first thing we were thinking about. It's something like this we were thinking. The virus hits China, it spreads exponentially through China. So Chinese industrial output falls, inputs to foreign factories can't be produced. That's a supply side effect. Our output declines. Chinese incomes fall, consumption declines, and then their imports decline and our exports decline. That's what we thought about. And we said, oh my gosh, in Spain, Spain receives a lot of Chinese tourists, and they sell a lot of luxury goods to the Chinese. And they sell a lot of, agricultural products to the Chinese. And so initially we were quantifying how those imports would hit us. And this is a big picture of what it would be. Say China were to grow by half. By the time all of this is over, they were to grow by half of last year. So only 3%. Commodity markets slow down because they're a huge producer of commodities. Luxury brands suffer. There's reduced travel. They are some of the biggest travelers in the world. This hits air transport, cruises, tourism. They are the biggest market for cruises, by the way. And then financial markets get worried because we're going to have a global recession. And then here's all the second round effects. Who's hit? Commodity exporters, developed countries, layoffs in developed countries, layoffs in tourism. And we go on down here and we find that it ends up in reducing growth for China. So really it's a circular thing, right? China shrinks, that makes us shrink, but since we import from China, China again shrinks, and it's a vicious inward cycle until something breaks it. But that was the initial calculation. Then we started to get coronavirus. And so, and we imposed quarantines. And so our own demand is collapsing. And I'm just going to show you a few pictures. This is entertainment, and it's just movie theaters, right? The number of people going to movie theaters. And you can see how this has declined in the United States by more than 50%, right? And you can see other countries around the world. Here's Spain. I don't know how big that number is, but anyway, doesn't look like a very good chart because it didn't look like Spaniards went to the movies at all. But anyway, so that's one area. Another one is restaurant bookings. Spain's not on this chart, but think how much Spaniards went out to eat. And so here you've got bookings for seated diners, a percent change, and this goes by the week, almost 100%. Of course, we can't go out and eat anymore. What about flight numbers going down from, more than 180,000 down to 140,000? And of course, that as more and more countries stop travel, that will continue to collapse. In fact, the Center for Aviation said that by the end of May, most airlines would be bankrupt if this continues. And energy use, again, you can see this in France, you can see it in Germany, they're all dipping. The only country that was still okay was the UK. But now that they've imposed restrictions, this will go down as well. However, there are some industries, again, thinking of the demand side, that are experiencing very high demand. And you all know about this if you go to the store. So there were no eggplants the other day. Toilet paper, we know about that problem. Flour, the flour was gone, right? So, because of stockpiling and hoarding, some industries are experiencing very high demand. The health industry is experiencing very high demand. This is US demand for ventilators. And this is a nice study done by Nielsen Retail, talking about the industries that have experienced higher demand. And this is just unbelievable. Medical supplies up 85%, rubbing alcohol up 65%. This is after Trump actually recognized that there was a pandemic. Bath and shower wipes, first aid kits. So just going through this list, you can see that, health industries and some cleaning products and then some staples to eat have gone up a lot. So, we have to weigh these two against each other, but clearly the balance is downward. It's interesting to see on the stock market that biotech and pharma companies, as the market crashes, this is the S&P 500 down 22.4%, these companies are going up. So, investors know that these companies will do well. But overall, the effect, if we add all of these up, the effect is profoundly negative. This takes just the US, the UK, the Eurozone, so Spain's in there, and China, and it's the Purchasing Managers Index. So this is a survey that's carried out constantly where managers that do purchasing say, how much more are you buying, or how much less are you buying than last year? And you can see the declines are very, very sharp. And this was just the UK by itself. You can see that services is hit much harder than manufacturing. That's important for Spain because Spain is a services economy. So we've looked at supply, and I'm going to try to convince you that the supply effect is pretty neutral because, we couldn't get parts, but energy prices are going down. We looked at demand, the net effect will be downward. And then there's the animal spirits. So if financial markets react sharply, this will destroy people's wealth and make them able to consume less. So markets have taken heavy losses. That's even with all the support they've gotten from central banks. Some people say they were just waiting for the crash. They've been nervous for a while. You can see Wall Street plunging. And you can see here, this is the S&P 500, the fifth biggest one-day drop on record. So 1987, 1929, 1929, 1929, and then March 12th, 2020, being one of the largest drops that the US stock market had ever suffered when it became aware of the pandemic, and that actually it was spreading in the United States. Here, these are changes. So you can see it's swinging, it's all over the place. And here we have 3 different indices. Now, the markets did react well when the stimulus package was announced, but still you can see, the market has gone down. It's not the very worst. This study was done recently by Goldman Sachs, where they said, okay, what happens when there's an event? Okay, that's the 4th bar in each of these charts. What happens when there's an event that drives the stock market, okay, instead of a cyclical situation? And so you can see that the fall can be 30% on average, has been 30% on average, but it doesn't last very long. They're saying it lasts about 10 months. And it recovers back to where it was before in looks like about 18 months. So events are smaller events on the stock market. However, if there's a recession, we would be moving into cyclical, and there the recovery is longer. Now, this is just markets bouncing around, but the problem is that it's occurring in a context when debt is historically high. Global debt hit a record high recently, and so if debt is very high and individuals and financial institutions begin to expect defaults, then this can turn into a financial crisis. So Asia Pacific is feeling this. The Chinese property market is very vulnerable, and sales are way down because of the virus. And if there were a chain of defaults there, it could set up a financial crisis. I don't think it would look, but we're always caught saying the wrong thing here. I don't think it could look like the world after the collapse of Lehman, because China is a lot less integrated with us. But then if we, the animal spirits on our markets, take it to heart and expect defaults, this could happen. Now, this is a cost of protection against default for junk companies recently in the United States. And you see, this has gone really up. This is an expectation of defaults. On the good side, the debt service ratio is not that high in most countries. This is something we were looking at when, you remember, the yield curve was inverting repeatedly in the United States, and markets were getting nervous, and they were saying, there's going to be a crisis. Well, this is one of the things that we look at. If interest rates are low and debt is not terribly high, and the interest rates are bearable for the economy, so you see Italy here pays very low interest rates, then there's less chance of a crash. So let's see how this goes. I think a lot will have to do with how quickly it spreads in the United States. So if we put this together, and I convince you, aggregate supply is not going to do anything, okay? But aggregate demand will be very sharply affected. This could have a large influence on output, okay? Some people are trying to put numbers on this. Some people are saying this is going to be the most severe contraction the US has ever recorded for consumption. Munchau from the Financial Times says this is going to be an economic shock, a corporate solvency crisis, a political crisis, all folded into one. And another one said, countries dependent on tourism, which is the case of Spain, which is the case of Italy, are facing an existential threat. So let's see if we can figure out how much this is, and it's 6:39. Let me see how quickly I can get through this, and then we'll deal with your questions. Obviously, the countries that are suffering the virus are affected the most. What containment strategy they use is affecting demand. So Spanish demand, for instance, has been affected astronomically by their containment strategy, but maybe it will shorten it in time. We'll see. Net exporters are vulnerable, okay? But every country is going to get hit as a ripple effect extends. Again, we mentioned tourism and luxury goods, and all importers may find themselves without essential parts. So as globalization kind of pulls apart, um, we believe that the US growth cycle is at an end. Goldman Sachs forecasts that the US economy will shrink 24% in the next quarter. 24% in the next quarter. Morgan Stanley says 30, okay? German industry is in deep contraction. You can see the Purchasing Managers Index in a number of countries around the world. We've looked at this before. And of course, trade being down, so trade can't save you. And if we think about Spain, and let's look at it in a little bit of detail to show what we might do. Here's just the background of the Spanish case, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this situation. We don't know if the peak has been reached. There's still going to be pressure on the health sector. But if we think about the economy, tourism is up to 15% of GDP, okay? And I would imagine that right now it's gone absolutely to zero. It was down even before the lockdown. A lot of companies are small and medium-sized firms, family firms, don't have a lot of capacity for debt. And many services that are big in Spain have been shut down. Now, we know the government has responded, and we'll talk about this. It is the largest stimulus package in history. But if we look at, a parenthesis, Spain is kind of unusual, isn't it? Because we said coasts, right? And you can see that it's pretty isolated, the effect of the pandemic here. But of course, Madrid is very globalized. So how will key sectors be affected? Well, we saw services is hit the hardest, and unfortunately, that's the biggest part of the Spanish economy. Now, what is the Spanish economy made up of? Well, this just goes through some of the sectors. So tourism, which is 15%, has collapsed. Will it recover in the end of the year? I don't think so. Tourists are very sensitive about countries having been dangerous places, so it might take a little while to come back. Construction, of course, is falling sharply. Some construction still happening. And of course, if health facilities have to be put up, that will be a demand, but I'm not going to be building a house right now or a new factory. Strong growth in health, and that's 12% of GDP. Retail has been completely interrupted. That's also 12% of GDP. So probably whatever health grows will be wiped out by retail. And then there will probably be losses in finance and in banking. Agriculture will continue to grow. The automotive industry has been severely interrupted, but that could be only temporary. And mining is the other one they put on here. But if you put all of these together, you see very substantial job losses. Look at the jobs in each of these sectors in the bottom part of that chart. And then the impact on the total, because remember, when I lose a job, the company stopped spending, but now I stop spending, which then means less demand for companies. So unless we can stop it with a government stimulus program, this just is a downward spiral. Goldman Sachs thinks that GDP growth rate will be the lowest in 30 years for the world, about 2%. That is considered a global recession. They don't believe there's a systemic risk. They think this is going to be more like 9/11 than like 2008. And that's something we might want to discuss. Here are some growth projections, just came out yesterday by the Institute of International Finance. So the blue line is the forecast made for this period, for 2020, the whole year, last year. And the light blue line is their new forecast for all of 2020. So they're expecting a shrinkage in the world. Okay, so Goldman Sachs again is optimistic. They're expecting mature markets overall to shrink by about 3 point something, the US by about 3. You can see the Eurozone, they're expecting a bigger contraction, more than 4. And Japan, they're expecting about 2.5. And then you see emerging markets, they expect to grow. So they expect that China will come back to growth, about 3% growth, as we mentioned before. Russia and Brazil will shrink. So those are their forecasts. And if this happens, then your global workforce loses a lot of income. Now, here are also some other projections. If unemployment rises by 24.7 million people, these are the losses we're going to see, the high estimate to income. So here are the three scenarios: 2% decline in global GDP. Then the ILO says global unemployment would rise by 5.3 million. 4% drop in GDP would be 13 million. And if global GDP drops by 8%, that's a terrible scenario, global unemployment would go up by 24.7 million. And we're at the end of our time, so I'm going to go quickly, but emerging economies have been hit. We're seeing sell-offs in emerging markets, stocks tumbling, their currencies going down, and they haven't really suffered the virus yet. And I just pray that it won't hit Africa because they have so much less infrastructure than we do to deal with an epidemic like this. So what are we doing? Well, we don't have a quantified Chinese response yet, but you know that the United States has passed the biggest rescue plan of its history. 9.8% of GDP just approved yesterday. The UK has approved a plan that's only about 1.4% GDP. It's not that big. Spain is a plan that could potentially be 15.4% of GDP if all of these avales, these government guarantees for loans are taken up. Denmark is a fascinating plan. It's going to cost them 13% of GDP in just 3 months. In just 3 months. Now, the rest of us are talking about a whole period, right? In just 3 months, because what they're doing is they're saying they're shutting down the country, and they're saying any company that has to fire your workers, send them home. We pay 75% of their salaries. We're also going to pay your rent and your energy, but you have to promise to take them back. Okay, so they're saying we're freezing the economy for 3 months. When it's over, everybody goes back to work and everything goes back to normal and there's no new debt. Even Germany is spending 5% of GDP. They're breaking their fiscal rules. In addition, there are other things. There's protection for people paying rent in some countries or paying mortgages. There's a grace period. There's going to be free testing, and there'll be means testing rules will be removed for some social benefits. So, all of these things are going in an effort to overcome these bad projections that we've mentioned. The Fed has cut rates to 0. Of course, not everybody can borrow the money to spend that much on the economy. And this is why these Euro bonds or Corona bonds are so important, because it would allow the countries that are suffering the most to be able to access credit markets at almost a 0 interest rate, take debt maybe at 100 years to cover this emergency. And a lot of government money is going to have to spend on pressing health needs. You can see a lot of countries, there's not a lot of doctors and nurses. This is a comparison. I also looked at hospital beds, and you see that Spain has 3,166 critically ill people, and they only have 4,400 critical care beds across the country. So very soon, maybe tomorrow, they hit their limit. And so, countries are going to be spending money on all of this too, trying to get enough personnel, trying to get enough facilities to cope with the crisis. Just what I'm concerned about are some of these long-term implications. Once we can go outside again, how do we return to the kind of vibrant, open, trusting maybe societies that we were? How long will it take confidence to come back for tourism, for travel, for for investment or spending on durable goods? How are countries going to do in terms of trying to get back to growth with a huge increase in debt? What's going to happen to developing countries? They're already being hit, but when the virus hits them, then we've got a catastrophe, right? There are some good things, like we're all learning to work 100% remotely, and I'm surprised at some of the people I talk to who are very happy with the experience. I am. Maybe globalization is going to go backwards. Maybe the savings glut will get worse. It's already a problem in the world, but some countries save a lot and don't spend it. And this means we need countries like the US to run large deficits to keep global demand going. Pensions crisis could get worse with interest rates now at zero almost everywhere. What about surveillance and monitoring technology? As they move into our lives, what happens in our battle for privacy? And clearly, we are seeing the need for global leadership, which is brilla por su ausencia, as they say in Spanish, which is very glaringly absent in some places. So we got through it, didn't we? But I did not take your questions, and I know that I think you have something going on afterwards. So, oh my gosh, there's a long chat here.
Thank you so much, Gayle. Thank you. It's been a great masterclass. We unfortunately don't have a lot
I
of
see
time
that.
for
But I'm also
the
looking at the
questions.
chat. A lot of them are just hello. So that's fine. And those of you who are my former
It's
students, how nice to see you.
exactly. A lot of people were very happy to see you
How
and
nice
hear
to
you.
see you.
And there has been some debate about the coronavirus versus the regular flu, the mortality rates, and how the flu is more, let's say, expected, but the coronavirus is something so new. Something about the trust we have or don't have in public administration, and also the important factor of misinformation in media. But I think that you have covered all of our thoughts and, I don't know, misunderstandings around the subject perfectly. And I think that everybody is really, really happy to have been here with us today. So thank you so much.
Well, I'm thrilled to see former students there. You know how happy that always makes me. So thank you. Thank you for being.
Thank you, Gail. You have a big bunch of followers, you know that.
Well, let's all be careful, guys. Really be
Yes.
careful. Being in the
Yeah.
middle of the storm here in Spain, it gets so
Stay
bad.
safe. Yes.
Be
Yeah.
careful and be healthy, and we'll live through the economy. We'll make it through the economy. Just don't want to lose too many lives on the way. That's what I think. That's the real battle right now.